Okay, well, welcome all. This is the final panel of the Data Ethics for All Summit. My name is Ben Hertzberg. I'll be your moderator today. I'm a director on the Chief Data and Analytics Officer Research Team at Gartner, the tech research and advisory company. But I also used to be a political philosophy professor. I taught politics at Emory and some other institutions. Data ethics is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I'll take a few moments to introduce your three illustrious panelists for today, and then I have a series of questions prepared and we'll have a rich discussion. You're in for a treat. So to begin with, at least on my screen, it's to my left. I don't know how it is for you. We'll start with Reid Blackman. Reid is the founder and CEO of Virtue, where he works with companies to integrate ethics and ethical risk mitigation into company culture and the development, deployment, and procurement of emerging technology products. He's also a senior advisor to Ernst & Young and sits on their AI advisory board. So welcome, Reid.
Thanks, Ben.
And then we have Swati Young. Swati is the Chief Technology Officer at Integrity Management Services, where she works with government and commercial enterprises to minimize the risk of improper payments, fraud, and abuse. She also works in particular to design AI solutions for business needs in healthcare. Welcome, Swati. And finally is Brian Greene. Brian is the Director of Technology Ethics at the Markula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University in California. His research there focuses on AI ethics, as well as the ethics of a whole bunch of other cool tech topics, space exploration and use, the ethics of risky technologies, and a wide variety of other topics. So welcome, Brian.
Thank you.
And the topic of the panel, as you all know today, is building ethical technology. So I wanted to start with a big question, but hopefully a provocative one. Where do ethical considerations best fit in the technology and software development process? And this has a corollary to it, which is, where do you, the three of you, see companies currently making mistakes as they attempt to incorporate ethical considerations into their product development? And we'll go from there.
So I'm happy to start, and I would just say, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm really excited to hear what everyone else on the panel has to say also. I would say the place to start with ethics is to have it everywhere. It needs to be at every layer in the organization, and trying to isolate it to one particular part of the organization is one of those problems that companies have. It needs to be really a part of the corporate culture. So we've been working at the Markula Center with various tech companies for several years now. And a lot of tech companies, if they're doing it right, it's part of the corporate culture, and everyone understands that it helps them have a better product and ultimately helps the bottom line. I mean, that's the good consequence that comes from ethics, is that it prevents problems from happening and ultimately helps you get your customers become more happy customers. On the other hand, if you're not paying attention to them, or if you're not paying attention to ethics and you're not paying attention to your customers, you can very often walk into traps and have all sorts of problems. Your product is not that popular. It's not fitting the market, right? Ultimately, it's something that harms the company. So it's really a matter of, if you can build it into your corporate culture at every level, from the engineer all the way up to the CEO, and the tone is really set from the top. If the tone is not being set at the top, then everyone knows what their incentives are, right? Their incentives are not necessarily to do the right thing. So it really needs to be at all levels, and if it's not, then that's where the problems happen.
Thank you, Brian.
I can add something to this conversation, and I'll be wary that I'm in the midst of philosophers here. I'm coming from an engineering background, but I agree to what Brian mentioned, but I want to add a little bit of nuance and color to this conversation. So like Brian mentioned, I say that ethics is not an engineering problem. It's a enterprise-wide problem. But having said that, I think it also starts at the business processes. And as a practicing data scientist, I observe a lot of things, both in federal agencies as well as commercial sector. So one of the things is I want to emphasize on the business process. So let me give an example. For example, if a business who gives loans for small businesses decides that they want to consider 10-year history of their criminal charges or traffic tickets or all their judgments and liens, that's a business decision. I might have been pulled over by a cop 10 years ago, might have not paid the fines, might have gone to court, and that is being considered after 12 years, whether to give me a business loan or not. That's a business decision. And the business process and the business decisions would drive the technology. So when it comes to an engineer's desk, they're given, these are the heuristics of the business rules. So now go and write a machine learning algorithm, right? So the conversation has to start with the stakeholders. The other mistake I see happening to your corollary question is sometimes machine learning algorithms or even statistical modeling can start in a particular department. It's not necessarily a top-down approach where the C-suite is involved in making a decision, oh, let's adopt enterprise AI or enterprise machine learning. Sometimes it starts in pockets where they're prototyping some stuff really quickly. And so the conversation is not happening outside those pockets of folks who are meddling with data. And the third point I want to address is that it's not a one size fits all. Let me explain that. For example, I was working on a lung cancer research and the correlation to lung cancer readmission rates using logistic regression, yada, yada, yada. But the question was, the data I started with came from a publicly available data set of all the lung cancer patients in the United States. And I went off that data and obviously analyzed it for bias, et cetera, et cetera. But what was missing is I did not know who labeled the data set, right? So for some use cases, it can start long before it comes to an engineer's desk or even a stakeholder's attention. It can start at a process where the data is collected and it's being labeled and you don't know. And we have heard horror stories of people labeling data at paying pennies on the dollar. So it's not one size fits all. The use cases are varied. If I'm predicting a machine's breakdown, I don't need to look at the ethics of it. But if I'm predicting much more variety of things, whether I'm making a judgment if a person has to be given bail or not, yes, that has to be considered. So to bring it home, I think one, it's not just an engineering problem. Two, it depends on the use case and you have to, your beginning of the use case can be variety of reasons across the spectrum of the life cycle. And three, it can be to do with your business process or the heuristics of your business rules.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Reid, did you want to jump in?
I mean, I don't think I have anything revolutionary to say. I think that Swati and Brian did a really good job of covering the main point, I take it, which is something like, it can't be a place. So the question, when it's formed as something like where in the organization should ethics be, is in some sense the wrong kind of question because it assumes that there is a place that it should be when in fact it should be roughly everywhere. But one thing I want to also highlight, and I think, both Brian and Swati mentioned this as well, really, is that it's not enough to just say ethics is important. Having an ethical culture doesn't mean anything if it's not backed up by process, by infrastructure, by financial incentives. People are going to, a lot of people want to be ethical. They want to take the ethical stuff really seriously in product development. But if they're financially incentivized to go a different direction, then most people will go in that other direction, blameworthy or not. That's just that's what they're going to do. So you need financial incentives to be properly created around the ethical infrastructure. Mm-hmm. The other thing to say is, so there's the responsibilities of each of the roles, so for instance, data collectors versus developers, they're going to have different kinds of responsibilities in order to make sure that things are, more or less ethically safe or safer than they would have been without those processes in place. It's also important to foster the right kinds of relationships among roles. So for instance, the developers should be in conversation with the data collectors to say, hey, listen, this is the kind of thing that we're trying to develop. Here's the kind of data that we need. Here's the kind of data that we think would be messed up. Here's where bias might creep in. So when you are putting together these data sets for us, here's roughly what we need them to look like. Otherwise, we're worried about bias popping up in various places. And then you need also, not just, if you, as it were, from the developers down, but the developers up, right? So if developers, product developers, et cetera, PMs are properly trained, they have the right kind of awareness of what the issues are, aside from the standardized approaches to bias mitigation, explainability, looking out for privacy violations, and so on and so forth, they also need to know what to do once they smell ethical smoke. So when they smell ethical smoke, what's the lever they pull? Who does it go to? Is it a deliberative body? Who's that deliberative body comprised of? What kind of framework do they have for making decisions? What kind of documentation processes are there around that? So culture is fine. It's great. It's absolutely necessary, but you also need process, which is not just a function of what are individual people responsible given their roles, but what are the kinds of relationships we have to create among roles and between roles.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. So let me try to get a little, I appreciate the broad overview, and parts of your comment have spoken to this, but if we were to think about, and because this is a group of people who are interested in data science and data ethics in particular, if we think about the algorithm development process as data sourcing, model development, model deployment, and monitoring and supervision, what ethical issues arise in each one of those processes? And is there one or the other that you have found in your experience is particularly troublesome in model creation and development from an ethical point of view? Should folks in the audience be most concerned about data sourcing, model development, model supervision, all three? Why or why not?
So I can start with that. So again, I would go back to the use case because AI is such an overloaded term. It has all these subfields under it. There's predictive analytics, natural language processing, robotics, etc. So it's very, very dependent on the use case. To Reid's point earlier, the developers have to speak to data sources. Not always, because developers sometimes, if I'm working in the healthcare sector and I want to work on, say, lung cancer research or anything else, I don't know where the data is coming from. There are some publicly, the nonprofits maintaining the data sets where you can buy the data from. So I absolutely don't have a clue as to where they're collecting. Obviously, they're collecting from hospitals. So it also depends on the problem. Sometimes if I'm within an organization where the data is coming, like I'm working for a federal agency and the data is held by the federal agency, yes, I have a purview into how the data is collected, but not necessarily all the time. But one thing I notice as a practicing data scientist is that the data bias is real, and there's nothing called unbiased data. All data is biased. This is because, say, for example, you're tracking credit card fraud. And so if you take 1 million credit card fraud transactions, 1 million, mostly 90,000 would be regular transactions, 10,000 would be fraudulent. And that is a bias by itself. It's very skewed data. So bias is the very common occurring thing for any data set, big or small, that you take. So that's a common thing, but obviously there are techniques like SMART and others that we, as any data scientist worth their salt, will apply. But having said that, again, the nuanced use cases, and nowadays we see second and third degree impacts. For example, facial recognition technology was initially developed many decades back, which did not use AI. But with AI coming into play, it exasperated all the nuances of ethnic and racial discrimination. So it has to be, now we heard the announcements even by IBM that it's put on hold. Similarly, I'll take another use case where one of my friends is working on predictive analytics of a ship breakdown for the US Navy. So in that case, yes, there is biased data and you will deal with some normalizing the data, but not necessarily study so much of the impacts of the ethical implications itself. So again, it depends on the use case. I see the bias is the most common thing, but having said that, recently I had the honor of participating in the ethical AI framework for the US federal government. And it's right now under review and we would be publishing soon. So there are 5 considerations we take into account. Bias I've already spoken about. The next step is fairness, transparency, responsibility, and interpretability. And each one obviously is a very nuanced subject, and you're all philosophers, you know it's not black and white. But monitoring for these 5, what we call the indicators, and then seeing how can we measure, is there a way to identify the presence or the impact of all these 5 indicators is one of the frameworks that I'm deeply and currently involved in. So again, in a nutshell, it depends on the use case and there are ways to deal with the data. But again, you have to look at the whole process, end-to-end process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Swathi. And we just got a question for Reid. Reid, how do you define specific use cases for AI bias for a given client? How do you integrate these use cases into their governance framework? And it looks like this is from Pamela, and Pamela says that she's developing a framework flexible to accommodate use cases, but also identify specific use cases.
Okay, so I think if I understand the question right, and Pamela, please tell me if I'm not understanding it right. It's something like, how do we take a general framework that articulates our general values, like war against discrimination or bias, and how do we take that and apply it to particular products that we're developing? I'm going to assume that's the question. You have 5 seconds to say otherwise. No. Okay, so I got it wrong. Oh no, thanks. Okay. I think I have it then. So good. I think this is a great question, and it actually dovetails really well with what the general question that Ben had asked, which was where are there problems? So one problem is that there is an absence of process by which developers think about, okay, how should we think about bias in this kind of case? So I'll give you a very simple case because I think fairness and bias is more complicated in a way. You might think that explainability is really important when you're developing AI models. Now, myself, I'm of the view that sometimes explainability is absolutely ethically imperative, and sometimes it's utterly ethically irrelevant. And sometimes it's ethically relevant, not by virtue of being, if you like, intrinsically important, but by virtue of its ability to give us insight into whether or not we're being discriminatory in an ethically objectionable way. And then sometimes explainability is really important, and sometimes it's a little bit important. And as we know, there are often trade-offs people need to make between how accurate we want it versus how explainable we want it, and how do we make those trade-offs. Now, one thing that you can do is, in your general framework, you have a particular articulation of the value of explainability and what about it is valuable, why it's important for your business purposes. For instance, as everybody knows, if you're in the mortgage lending business, explainability is going to be really important for certain sorts of decisions. Other decisions, not so important. So your general framework might articulate why explainability is important, but then you might have a process in place in the course of product development, presumably extremely early on in that process, where you ask, okay, look, is the value of explainability as articulated by our general framework, is it relevant in this particular case? And if it is, if explainability is important, how important is it? You know, maybe you have a way of articulating exactly how important that is to give developers some guidance about how to make that kind of trade-off. Now, you take that sort of general approach, and you're going to wind up with the same thing when we're talking about bias and fairness. The problem with that is, as a lot of people know, especially if you're developing products, is that whole thing is a mess. It's a total mess. So fairness in machine learning is a mess for a variety of reasons. One reason is that there are literally dozens of so-called definitions of fairness, not all of which are compatible with each other. And so that's one issue. So you already need a process that says something like, if one of these kinds of definitions is appropriate, which one would it be and why? And there needs to be a process for determining that. And if the developers can't determine that, then there needs to be a body to which they can appeal, or at least a more senior leader to which they can appeal to answer such a question. And then there's another question of, is there an issue of fairness? That is to say, might we do something unfair or unjust in a way that's not captured by any of these so-called mathematical definitions of fairness? And there's lots of ways of doing that. There's lots of ways going wrong because there's lots of ways of wronging people that are not about allocating goods to one subpopulation, more frequently than you do another, which is essentially what most fairness in machine learning is about. So you're going to need a process by which a qualitative assessment is made, either by an individual or ideally a set of individuals, where it's assessed what situation are we in? What are the kinds of wrongs that we're concerned about? I'll just want to highlight that last thing that I said, which is that people talk a lot about bias. The heart of the issue, though, is whether you're wronging anybody. No, not just harm. You can harm people without wronging them, but whether you're wronging them. And so one way that people need to think about their particular use cases is, if we use if we go to product development using this model, who are we going to wrong, if anyone? And are there ways of making it the case that we wouldn't wrong those people? I don't know, I just threw a lot out there. Pamela, I hope that was at least mildly helpful. If not, ignore me, or we'll have a one-on-one.
Great, thank you, Reid. Brian, I wanted to give you a chance to chime in either on the question that Swathi was answering about ethical problems in the model development and supervision, or Reid's discussion of use case and institutions to provide for fairness.
Right, they both Reid and Swathi had really good answers. So I just have a little bit to add to that. And of course, the bias issue is something that people have been talking about for years. So bias is absolutely a problem, and it's going to continue being a problem. And as Reid was saying, there are many different definitions of fairness, right? So if you're getting unfair bias in a data set and coming out in a model and it's wronging people, then you have to figure out, in what sense is it unfair? Is it too many false positives, too many false negatives? Are we having different types of negative effects coming out of it? So that's certainly a major issue. Another problem that I've been hearing about from people that we've been working with are the problem of off-target use of models. So you get your machine learning model and it's designed for one setting, and then you say, oh, let's just start using it over here instead. And that ends up with a whole bunch of problems associated with it too, and negative outputs and getting all sorts of problems associated with it. So that's on the more model side of things. And also, very often a company will create these sorts of products and give them to the customer, and the customer doesn't know exactly what the parameters are within which they should be using this model, and that can sometimes lead to this. So there's definitely communication that needs to happen between developers in tech companies and customers, so that they know what the limitations are of the model, where they should be using it, and those sorts of questions.
And just to add to that, I think it's the whole life cycle of the model. So initially you might start off from a particular data set, but as you know, the machine learning algorithm is learning continuously as the data keeps increasing. So it might start with one thing, but totally become something else as additional data sets keep getting added.
Right. So as the model drifts, new ethical issues may arise. Right? Thank you. I'm aware that we have just 8 minutes in our allotted time left, so I want to skip to one of our last questions, which is that those of you in the audience and all of our panelists are, to some degree, we're already converted, right? We are here. We're people who care about data ethics. We care about bias mitigation. We care about non-discrimination. As folks in the audience, and as you're working with your clients or your companies to encourage data ethics, encourage proper procedures, what advice do you have for people to aid them in getting buy-in for data ethics initiatives, programs, governance, and related issues?
So I was just talking to someone at a company just a few minutes ago, where they said the way you get buy-in is to make it, count in dollars. Say, look, we're making a product here. We want the product to work. We want it to help people. We don't want it to have negative effects. We don't want to have blowback from it that's going to make us look bad. Ultimately, if you talk about making better products that help people more, then that's where you get buy-in. It's great if you can have an entire culture around that, which is much deeper, right? But ultimately, if you're trying to just get a good effect, then that's what you need to argue, and that's a consequential, form of consequentialist reasoning if you want to talk about ethics. But if you can get if you can get something much broader than that, where the corporation is working for social benefit and those sorts of questions, you can do that also, and it strengthens the way the culture in your company works. But if you're working at the bare bones level and you just want to get a good output, then that's the argument that you can make.
Thank you, Brian.
So one of the things that I think is really important Brian's absolutely right. If you can't appeal to the bottom line, then it's going to be phenomenally difficult to get a private company to take this stuff seriously. So you have to connect to the bottom line. As Brian has articulated, there are loads of ways of doing that, both in terms of providing a better product, reputational risk, the possibility of getting investigated by regulators, as a number of companies are now for at least allegedly biased algorithms. So you absolutely have to appeal to that. The other thing that I think is crucial that doesn't get talked about as much is that you need the buy-in of the developers, the data collectors, the engineers, et cetera. Now, that's really hard if you have a certain kind of mindset around ethics that the vast amount of people do, which is that ethics is just subjective, it's squishy, it's just a matter of opinion, which is a sort of loose way of saying it's BS. It's just whatever you think it is. And as you know, Ben, I was a philosophy professor for a long time. The vast majority of my career has been that as an ethicist. And what I found in decades of conversations with people is that if you can't get them to see ethics as something other than just subjective and wishy-washy and squishy and just a matter of opinion, then you can't get them to really engage in ethical conversation seriously. So one of the things that I think is absolutely crucial is to drive home. You can say that ethics is objective, or at the very least, you can say that the arguments for why most people think it's subjective are just horrendously bad arguments. And luckily, engineers, for instance, like arguments. They like hard-nosed arguments. They like, a kind of intellectual battle. And there's an actual intellectual battle to be had there, which is relatively easy to win. And it's crucial because if engineers think that it's just fuzzy and squishy and soft, then they're not going to take it seriously. And so part of the buy-in is getting them to take ethics itself seriously.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I would say I concur with a lot of stuff that Reid and Brian have mentioned. But as an engineer, there are a few of us who still believe in evaluating ethics of what we develop, design, and deliver. But again, I would like to divide this conversation into twofold. One is product-based companies. So you're talking about, and this is products like, Facebook having secondary effects or any other for that matter, any product coming out of Silicon Valley. But second is also what solutions are being implemented in whether it's federal agencies or commercial organizations. So I'll take the example of federal agencies. So if Center for Medicare and Medicaid wants to investigate fraudulent doctors, okay, because that's the business we are in, my company is in. Mm-hmm. And we currently use statistical modeling, and we are experimenting to use machine learning. We definitely have to think about whether the machine learning algorithm is going to be biased and has ethical bad outcomes to healthcare providers who might be unnecessarily investigated because a recommendation was given by the algorithm. So thinking through those use cases and outcomes is very, very important. So I think that's where the conversation has to happen. It's the responsibility of a good data scientist to bring those outcomes to the forefront. One, two, it's also the committee of stakeholders to have that broader conversation. Like I like to say, I came from the world of software development where we didn't care about so much about these topics. But now AI is more than engineering and data science. You need to have the philosophers in the room and neuroscientists in the room to have those conversations. And secondly, yes, talking about the bottom line, I think the very fact that a revenue line of business like facial recognition technology was shut down by IBM shows that fast and furious in the world of AI is not a long-term strategy. Mm-hmm. So the whole line of business has been shut down because you might not build a robust product in the long run if it's coming under investigation by regulators. So yes, there is an impact both ways, and socially responsible organization is a thing in the world of Black Lives Matter. So I think more organizations, it's not just the bottom line, it's how can they brand themselves. It's a matter of actually becoming more socially responsible as well.
Thank you, Swati. And in the final minute, I'll just riff a bit off of the question from Bruce, who linked to Google's commitment to racial equality. We've seen lots of this from large corporations putting, tweeting black boxes for Black Lives Matter. So is it real or is it ethics washing in 30 seconds or less?
It's too soon to tell. We have every reason for thinking it's just PR unless we can see the concrete strategies and tactics that they're going to implement in the very short, mid, and long term.
Yeah, I agree. And I think until the feet is held to the fire, it's always a conversation. What is the accountability? What is the policy and regulation? Those are questions unanswered, and it's only going to amplify in the future. So right now it's narratives, conversations, lots of frameworks, but I think this conversation will help us get there. We would like to be to hold organizations accountable, but we need to get there and increase these conversations in order to get there.
Thank you, Swati. Brian, do you want a last word?
I would just say that Swati and Reid I completely agree, and it's really a question of I think there really are good intentions, right? And the question is, how do those good intentions actually turn into something concrete and practicable and something that's actually going to have an effect on the company? And it's that transition from intentions to actions that can be very difficult. And it's one of those things where, yes, they need to continue to have their feet held to the fire and make sure that something good actually happens.
Great, thank you. And we are at time, so if we could have a virtual round of applause for our panelists, Reid, Swati, and Brian.
Thank you, everyone.
And then I'll turn the time back to Shilpi.
Oh, thank you, everyone. Thanks, Ben, for moderating. Excellent moderation. And Reid, Brian, and Swati, loved your discussion. I think we need to have a special conference just on this. This is so fascinating. And how can we bring frameworks and governance and actual, in all this ethical discussion? There's always building ethical technology discussion, but the data piece is missing. And because it doesn't affect the bottom line, right? So if it affects the bottom line, like you guys were saying, that's the best way to convince people and organizations to adopt those kind of practices. So great conversation. Thanks for coming and chatting with us, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.